Good morning, everybody, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present these few slides about competition at this seminar organized by the Taub Center. As is shown in this slide, the title of the presentation is Boosting Competition for More Productive and Inclusive Economy. Inclusive economy is something which is important at the OECD. We're not talking about growth, but we are trying to discuss something which is broader than that, which is basically sharing for everybody the benefit of growth, which we call inclusive growth. So my presentation will be divided in a few parts. We will focus on, as mentioned by Liora, an important aspect of the 2016 survey that we released yesterday. And this is the need to address the problem of productivity by boosting competition and improving the functioning of product markets. As you will see in the presentation, we found consistent evidence of shortcomings of product markets, which are weakening productivity, even though these deficiencies are not the only one which explain basically the difficulty that we found with efficiency. There are also factors at play. As you will see in this presentation, we found consistent evidence of the shortcomings of the product market, as I said, and then I will present and discuss and give an overview of the various recommendations that the OECD proposed to Israel to improve the situation concerning competition. Finally, the presentation will focus on a brief presentation of a quantification exercise that we've included in the survey concerning the benefit of reforms related to the product markets. So first, few slides about the context that, of course, you know very well, where output growth and employment performance have been strong in Israel over the last decade. Israel is, I think, in the 13th consecutive year of growth, with an average growth which has reached 4% a year on average. And as mentioned by Avi before, employment performance has been very good. Employment rate has increased steadily over the period and is now well above, the OECD average. The consequence of that, if you look at the red line, which is on this slide, is that there was a convergence in per capita GDP between Israel and the top half of OECD countries. The difference, in percentage rate between the two has moved from 40% in 2004 to slightly below 30%. But what is more striking on this slide is the blue line, which is the productivity developments. As you can see, it's pretty flat and even somewhat declining, which shows that the productive performance in Israel has been weak for more than 2 decades. Well, as our Secretary General said it yesterday in a pretty blunt way, is that for every hour's work in Israel, output is less than 60% of that achieved in the top half of OECD economy. And this figure hardly budged over the last 2 decades, and it has even declined somewhat. So this situation is, to some extent, paradoxical for 2 reasons. The first one is usually when you have a catching up economy like Israel, you should observe, a convergence process for productivity. This is what we see for most other countries. I am going to work on Slovakia. Slovakia is a poor country, OECD country, and the productive performance is really going very fast. And they are catching up. They have productivity growth rates, which is more than 3% a year. And this is a kind of normal process. The second reason why it is surprising is, well, you are the startup nation, which, I mean, means that your innovation sector is pretty good. And it is paradoxical to see that although you have a very well-developed innovation sector, the diffusion in innovation in the rest of the economy seems to not working very well, since overall the productivity performance is so flat and so bad. So as I mentioned before, there could be several factors and several reasons for this productivity performance, including the integration of the workers of low qualification in the labor market, which partly explain the strong employment growth of the past few years. However, in the context of the 2016 report of the OECD, our attention has been focused on competition-related issues. And of course, one of the key reasons for focusing on that is this is very high on the policy agenda for a number of years, including since 2011, 10 protests. And we definitely found consistent evidence of shortcoming in product markets that we are going to see now. Okay, these slides, are probably very familiar to many of you, since they have been borrowed from work done here at the Taub Institute and also at the Bank of Israel. And this provides the first interesting insight, in my view, about the productivity paradox that I mentioned before. It shows basically the existence of a functioning of the economy which is dual in terms of productivity. As you see on the left-hand side, basically, you have, a highly productive sector in the tradable industries, which coexist with an inefficient shelter sector to an unusual extent, which is dragging down basically the overall productivity performance that we have seen in the previous slide. Okay, this left-hand slide doesn't show any international comparison. This is why we've put the other graph on the right-hand side, which shows basically the productivity gap, by sector, compared to the comparison, the gap between Israel and the OECD average. And what you see on this chart is a positive correlation between the integration of the sector in international trade, global trade, and this gap, and which shows that the more exposed to foreign trade and the more integrated in global trade, the more productive you are. And in the case of Israel, you can see that actually for the sector which are in the red circle, you are doing better than OECD average. And the opposite is true. When you look at the green circle, where if you are protected, if you are not involved in the global economy, basically, then your performance is poor. And this is exactly what you are seeing. Food, agriculture, you see, are doing poorly. When you see, on the other hand, medical equipment, communication equipment, chemical, etc., the performance is much better. Okay, a second insight I would like to draw your attention on is the degree of foreign exposure of the Israel economy and its integration in the global value chains of production. As you see on the left-hand side, basically, when you talk to many Israelis, their response is, yes, we're a small open economy. Actually, when you compare Israel with other small open economy in OECD, you see that Israel is quite closed. This presents basically the ratio of import and exports over GDP in the mid-90s and for the most recent period available, which is 2013 and 14. And you see that, already in the mid-90s, Israel was not less exposed, or less open, I would say, to foreign trade than OECD average. But what is more striking is that the difference was not so large, and there are other reasons, and many reasons which may explain why Israel is more close in a sense. But over time, the gap has increased sharply. And we could say that, well, the openness of the average small OECD countries is almost double now what it is in Israel. On the right-hand side, you have another information which give you basically Israel presence in what we call the global value chains, GVCs. GVCs is basically kind of statistics which have been developed at the OECD and in collaboration with other institutes to see and to capture the fact that the process of production now is split between countries. You have big firms which do not produce a single product in a country. If you take, say, Apple, a company built products by cutting, the various process of production in different parts of the world. What you see in this chart is the presence of Israel in the value chain has weakened since 1995 compared to the most recent period available according to the statistics that we have. And there are only a few countries like Israel in this chart. Indeed, what we observe at the global level is this process of production is increasingly splitted between countries. Basically, this is a development that we see globally. So this situation concerning trade, can reflect a number of factors, and not all of them are related to competition. Of course, we have to keep in mind that the geopolitical situation of Israel is special, which means that you don't trade very much with your neighbors, and this is, of course, one of the reasons why, which explains partly this phenomenon. Another aspect that we have looked at concerns the customs tariffs. And as you can see there, you are basically not too far away from the OECD average, which suggests that, well, custom tariff probably do not contribute much to the relatively low average foreign exposure of goods and services market. Now, when you look at the non-tariff barriers, there you have a pretty different picture. Non-tariff barriers are high in many sectors in Israel. There are cumbersome and costly import procedures, for instance. There are specific norms. There are technical obligations. And all these obligations are quite often very different from the international standards that we can see. And we can have in groups like the EU or the US with Canada and Mexico. These add burdens, basically, and this hamper, basically, the growth of parallel imports that compete with exclusive exporters. This is one important aspect. Another aspect, it also weakens Israel's presence and integration in the GVCs, as I mentioned. One aspect which needs also to be looked at concerns the service sector. This is the right-hand side panel. We have an indicator at the OECD, which is a Service Trade Restrictiveness Index. And basically, what this chart shows, that Israel is on the right-hand side, which means that the degree of restrictiveness in the sector of services is the highest in the OECD. These restrictions are at two levels. It can be sector-specific restriction, but it is also restrictions which are more of a global nature, like the ability to have foreign workers coming to Israel, which create a problem for a foreign company to open a business here in some service sector, like professional services, or sector like the rail freight. As I mentioned as you mentioned at the bottom of the slide, we, in our reports, praise basically the recommendation of the Long Committee to simplify import procedure and to align them with those enforced with other developed countries. So this is a good thing. But one thing that would need to be looked at again and more deeply is probably the service sector, where probably more work needs to be done. Another aspect which is important in our views concern what we call the product market regulation. We have developed, probably many of you know the World Bank indicators which are called doing business. We have developed at the OECD product market regulation indicators. And this slide shows that the product market indicators in Israel are the most restrictive, or among the most restrictive in the OECD. Actually, when you also look at the result found by the World Bank concerning the similar kind of indicators, you see that basically the ranking of Israel in OECD has declined. Before they were in the 30th position, 30 rank, and they have moved down to the 40th place in the World Bank doing business 2015. The restrictive effect of this regulation affect many areas. Some of them create barriers in some specific sectors, like retail trade, the network industries, professional services. We'll see that in a moment. But there are other type of regulation, including very complicated procedures for obtaining a license, for instance, which have more pervasive influence affecting many markets. And this is the case, for instance, of environmental regulation. We'll see that also later. Another aspect which is important and we have to keep in mind concerns the existence of monopolies or oligopolies in many sectors. To cite few, food, banking, electricity, gas, railways, seaports, cement, and so on. So there is many sectors with a structure which is not really competitive, and all these monopolies tend to inflate basically their margin and prices rather than to try to improve their efficiency. So the key impact of all these factors and the efficiency of product markets affect productivity. This is the main effect. Basically, the less competitive product market environment is, less firms you have which are able to challenge the incumbents. Firms are difficult to grow, basically, and the inefficient firms, cannot exit, basically, the market. And all of that hinder, basically, the good allocation of resources, and which in turn means low wages. But there is another factor, which is also, the effect on prices, and this is what is shown in this chart. Basically, you've seen that we've put basically the level of prices compared to, in the horizontal axis, per capita GDP. And you see that Israel, has prices which are 20% on average above Spain, which has a similar standard of living measured by per capita GDP, and 30% above Korea. And the price level is pretty similar to countries which are much higher standard of living than Israel. So overall, all this evidence of shortcomings of the product markets, which are contributing to weaker productivity and relatively high prices, are of course detrimental for growth, but also for inclusive economy. Even though, as I said, there are other factors which are at play. So now I would like to talk about the main recommendation of the OECD concerning the reform that could be made in the sector. And our survey identified two main directions on the basis of both a sectoral approach and a more horizontal analysis. At the sectoral level, basically, we have identified three main sectors where we think that priority should be given, and the sectors are food, banking, and electricity. If you take the more horizontal level, basically the priority is twofold. I mean, the first one is to open more widely the economy to foreign competition. And the second aspect is to make regulation more business-friendly and to improve the effectiveness of government intervention. So let's see now what this means in practice. If we start looking at the food issue, I mean, this slide shows, I mean, with more detail where the in which sector for which kind of products the price of products are high. And as you can see, there are the bold, I mean, names. Most of them are food products. And you can see that the difference relative to the OECD average in terms of the price in Israel can exceed 50% for some type of products, including dairy products and non-alcoholic beverages. The issue related to this sector include multiple aspects, such important barriers for food products due to the agricultural policy. There are non-tariff barriers that I mentioned. I mean, and this includes also the religious dietary rule, which is in Israel. And a third aspect is a regulatory and competition problem, which are associated with excessive concentration in the production and retail distribution of food products. I mean, if I take the dairy industry, I mean, this illustrates pretty well the situation. What you have there is a sector where producer prices are controlled. You have quotas, you have tariffs, you have several non-tariff barriers, you have consumer price control, and the result of that is what you see on the chart, that you have prices which are higher than elsewhere, and a huge waste of resources. So several actions have been taken recently, I mean, to address this issue, and we have, however, more suggestion, I mean, for the authority, I mean, to make more progress in this domain. So if we look at the agricultural sector, what you see on the left-hand side, on the top panel, is basically the measure of the subsidies of Israel to the agricultural sector. It's not high. I mean, for the recent period, I mean, this is a purple bar, and you see it's something like 8% of the production of the sector, which is not high compared to the OECD average. This is about half of it. It's also much lower than what it was in the mid-90s. Now, there are different ways of providing subsidies to the agricultural sector. And what you can see in the bottom panel on the left-hand side is that more than 80% of the support are basically based on distortive action, distortive measure like quotas, tariffs, barriers of any sort. And on the top of that, I mean, the intervention are very heterogeneous, which means that in some sector, I mean, there is no, basically no barriers, whereas the tariff or the barrier are very high in some very specific sector. And this is especially the case when you look at the dairy products, for instance, or meat. As a result of that, if you look at the gap between the domestic production price in Israel and the international price, in the case of milk or beef, you see that the difference reach 37% and 73% respectively. So 37 for the milk and 73 for beef between 2011 and 2013. So at the beginning, I mean, you have already at the production level a very large difference because of this protection. And our recommendation of the survey is basically to replace all this quota, guaranteed prices and custom tariff with direct payment to farmers. If you want to help people, I mean, in the agricultural sector, just give them money. I mean, that will be much less distortive. I mean, the problem with the tariff concerning dairy products, you can see on the right-hand side panel. They are, I mean, very high. But beyond the agricultural policy, there are additional reforms which would need to be addressed concerning the food industry. And to start with, I would like to talk about reform which have taken place recently, which were, I think, recommended by the local committee, concerning the red tape and import procedure for what we call non-sensitive products. Basically, what has been decided that for the products which are presenting a low health risk, the decision has been, or the recommendation by the local committee has been to align all this import procedure to what is done in other OECD countries. So just to simplify the system. But these recommendations was a little bit, I mean, well, not ambitious enough in our view, because it means that all the sensitive products were completely forgotten from the change. The sensitive products, of course, need to get more attention than the other products. But, I mean, all the cumbersome procedure which exists in Israel, which are different from what they are in other countries, implies that for all these products, and these products represent 50% of imports in Israel, for half of imports, all these products still face a very cumbersome procedure. And the safety, health safety rules which are used in other countries are also, I mean, pretty good. So there is no reason to align for all products, I mean, the rules concerning these imports. Concentration is also high, I mean, in the agricultural, I mean, sorry, the food sector, both at the production and at the distribution level in Israel. And what we see on this slide concern an indicator which have been developed in relation to the PMR, product market regulation indicators that we saw at the beginning, and concern the fact that rules are pretty restrictive at the retail trade in Israel compared to other OECD countries. More specifically, it means that there are requirements, authorization which are asked for people when they want to establish a new business, which are more restrictive in the sense that you have the representative bodies of the company which are already established. We are present to for the approval, basically, of a new the opening of a new outlet of supermarkets. Recently, there was a law also which was adopted under the advice of the antitrust authority, which was to foster the local competition in the retail sector. And this was, of course, a good initiative. Now we have to see how it is implemented, and our recommendation is that, I mean, this implementation should be very strict. Another recommendation that we have is basically something that we have recommend for other countries, which is going to go through all, I would say, the regulation which exists in the food sector, but this can apply to the sector, all the law which exists, and to screen that laws, I mean, just to see what are the provisions there which may prevent or reduce competition. We have developed at the OECD what we call an OECD competition assessment toolkit, which basically help government to do that. And we think that it would be a good idea to do similar things in Israel. Banking sector. Well, the banking sector has done very well during the financial crisis in Israel. in terms of financial stability. But its structure is not very good, at least for competition. It is very concentrated, as is shown in this chart. There is no foreign bank in the retail banking in Israel. I don't think there is online banking either. And the main players are closely interconnected and sharing, for instance, management of the credit card systems. So the consequence of that is basically that the efficiency ratio of this bank is relatively weak. I mean, this measure basically the share of salaries, I mean, to income. They are also pretty slow to adopting innovation like internet banking. So I know this has been a subject which has been discussed a lot in the recent period with committees like the Zaken Committee or the Sturm Committee. And there were a number of recommendations which were made, I mean, to improve the system. And I think these recommendations are going in the right direction and should be properly implemented. There are two things I would like to stress in this domain. I mean, two important aspects. The fact that it is important to create an open credit rating system for households and SMEs. There is a barrier of information for newcomers, I mean, in this sector, especially foreign banks. So if they can have access to information concerning household and SMEs, this would help them to enter the market more easily. And the second one is also, I mean, to allow non-banking entities, non-banking credit entities, to enter the markets and to compete against banks. Another suggestion that we have in the report is possibly to try to make a better use of the postal services. I mean, there is a lot of agencies. I know postal services have not a good reputation in Israel, but I'm not talking about post office. I'm talking about agencies. I mean, in many other OECD countries, postal agencies are used, I mean, can be used even not by the postal services, by other banks, other new entities who can enter the market, just to be able to give access to credit and to open competition. So that's something to think about. Network industries, another sector where probably some action also is needed. There were, I mean, the past year, a number of reforms which have given some very good results. I'm thinking about air transport, for instance, about mobile telephony. Recently, I mean, there was a decision to unbundle, I mean, the local loop of e-commerce operator for the fixed broadband sector, fixed internet sector. This is also good, and there is a reform which has taken place in the postal services. All of that is welcome, and this should be good for consumer services if it's properly implemented. But to be sure that the implementation is good, I mean, one of our recommendations is to make sure that you have independent regulators that can guarantee that there is a neutral and transparent application of these reforms. What we have observed in Israel in general is, I mean, independent regulators are not something which is quite often used in Israel. They are part of the government, part of some ministries, and we see that as a problem for implementation on the ground of reform. And there are, of course, two important reforms where more progress could be made, which are electricity, where we need a separation between generation, transmission, and distribution. This is very important, and this is a long overdue reform. And there is also room for competition in the railway sector, where, I mean, there is still a monopoly. Oops, I think I've gone too far. Okay, last slide concerning our recommendation. And this relates to the government intervention. So beyond these sector-specific adjustments that we've mentioned before, there is a need, I mean, to reduce existing regulatory burden. And this is something which is recognized by the authorities. Yesterday, I mean, when we released the survey, I attended, I mean, a cabinet meeting, which was, I mean, a very amazing experience for me. But I would say all the discussion, or most of the discussion, was about regulation. I mean, and there was a kind of agreement around the table among all ministries that regulation is way too heavy in Israel, and I mean, and growing and growing. I mean, there is a sense that, I mean, in general, that more laws, more regulation means doing a good job for, I think, for the Knesset, but also for ministers. I mean, so there is a kind of inflation that needs to be stopped. It doesn't mean that the question of regulation is bad per se. I mean, there are good and bad regulation. What is needed, I mean, is avoiding excessive regulation and making sure that you have the good one. This is what is important. I mean, you do need to have regulation, but it should be focused on what is important and what is good. So the charts, I mean, show or put in perspective basically the situation regarding regulation, I mean, in a few sectors. And you can see, for instance, I mentioned that before, that concerning environment, I mean, we measure that the stringency of environmental regulation is pretty tight, I mean, pretty tough in Israel compared to OECD average. So the government has some, I mean, commitment to reduce existing regulation by 25%. I mean, this is a commitment by 2019, which is a very ambitious objective, and to screen all the new laws that could affect competition as from this year. The question now is how it is done. I mean, because we have seen in many other countries that ministers say, oh, we have to go through a procedure. So they pretend they do something and they tick, say, this is done. What is very important is to make sure that you have a high quality regulatory impact assessment which is done, and you have really strong enforcement of this procedure. Another aspect which is important is public procurement. There is a reform which is needed, I mean, to standardize the system and to accelerate the reform which is underway. This is pretty important. And another aspect which relates to the antitrust authority and to improve its efficiency. In our view, there is two things that could be done there, which is increasing the maximum fines, which could be paid, I mean, by a company which is infringing competition laws, and also reforming the leniency program. Basically, leniency program cannot be used once you have an investigation which has started. Even if, I mean, you could use that to speed up the process and even improve the result of this investigation. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation with two slides. As I mentioned before, I want to talk briefly about the quantification exercise of the potential benefit of a program with substantial reform of product markets. And to give you an idea about what we've done with the exercise, we've based it on 3 steps. So basically, the first step was to decide to estimate the effect of a convergence of Israel aggregate PMR indicator, the product market regulation indicators that we have seen at the very beginning of the presentation, to the OECD average. So we are not talking about Israel converging to the best, I mean, performing countries concerning product market regulation, but simply the average. This would mean a reduction of the regulation as measured by our PMR by 33%. This is a big number, a third. This means an ambitious reform program. But you have to know that several countries like Greece, Hungary, Italy, Poland, I mean Slovakia, Portugal, have done that, I mean, or even more than that, reduce their PMR indicator over a period of 10 years. I mean, this is not something which can be done overnight. This is a process. You have to go sector by sector to look at what is wrong, make adjustments, I mean, fight against lobbies and so on, and do it. But this can be done. Then the second step was, I mean, to quantify once we've decided the size of the shock. And basically, the way it has been organized is on the base of a set of equations which were estimated for 24 countries, OECD countries, with sectoral TFP growth and a link of this TFP growth equation at sectoral level with a regulatory impact indicator for each sector, which take into account also the fact that you have intermediate goods used by the sector. So we take into account the input-output matrix in this calculation. In the case of Israel, unfortunately, we didn't add, I mean, the TFP time series at the sectoral level that we needed. So what we've done is to use as a proxy, I mean, 3 countries where for which data were available, which are Korea, Spain, and Portugal. So we've run, I mean, this shock, and basically what we found was that if you move to the OECD average regulation, then you can get an increase in per capita GDP by about, well, almost 4%, 3.75% after 5 years, and 5.75% after 10 years. This is about between 0.5 and 0.75% of additional growth a year over this period. So this is a sizable number. Okay, of course, I mean, this is an order of magnitude. As I mentioned, we have used proxies, we have done some, but this number looks really reasonable. We've done similar exercise with other countries, and the numbers that we found are okay. Now, we've tried to see, okay, if we use Korean numbers rather than the Spanish number or the Portuguese number, in all cases, we get back to the similar quantification. By the way, the input-output matrix was an Israeli input-output matrix, not another matrix. So, so it is worth, I mean, doing, I mean, an effort, a continuous effort, as I said, because this is not something which is done overnight. I mean, this is something on which you have to work, I mean, continuously for a long period. But the benefit can be well, significant. Of course, I mean, this quantification was run by changing the regulation immediately. When you take into account that, of course, I mean, the shock is spread over a period of several years, I mean, the benefit will probably be spread over a long-term period. So, as I said, this is another of magnitude of the change, which means that it's worth doing, but no more than an order of magnitude. Thank you.
We're just going to have, thanks so much, Claude, for providing that external, unique perspective on competition in Israel. Really, really interesting findings that I think will be the basis for discussion in the country for quite some time. So we'd like to just give a few minutes, probably about 5 minutes for Q&A for Claude, and he'll also be joining us in the end of the panel discussion and be available for more Q&A following the panel.
I had 2 questions about the data. The chart with the service sector, with Israel being the highest, can you drill down on that a little bit and why that is? And the second question was exports versus imports. Usually we see a breakdown of how much is exports and how much are imports, especially with the startup nation, the impact of that on exports.
Okay, let's go back to the slide with what we call the STRI indicator. Okay, this indicator is a relatively new indicator which has been developed by the OECD. There you've got the simple picture. Actually, this indicator in the survey, and you can find it in the document that we have produced, but also in the OECD website, has been built sector by sector. So they have gone through all the service sector and sent a questionnaire about the regulation for all countries on the potential bottlenecks or obstacles to competition which exists in all the sectors. For instance, in railways, the fact that you have basically a monopoly means there is no competition. So for this specific sector, Israel has the worst, ranking, you can say. Then sector by sector, they ask a number of questions. And there are a number of problems which exist for specific sector. I'm thinking, for instance, for air transport, something will come to my mind. There is a problem in the case of Israel for companies to exchange slots. It's not so easy, when they want to have a slot in airports. So this is not the case for other countries, which means that for air transport, because of that question, Israel is not doing well. One important factor across the board, which was a problem, was the difficulty to bring into Israel foreign workers. This is a problem for across the board for all service companies because, for services, basically, you need people. Of course, local people, but quite often, especially if it's a foreign company, you need also to have foreign people to come. Doesn't mean that it is impossible, but you have to get a permit of residence for 1 year, and then to renew that. And for people who want to come here with their family and so on, this creates a barrier. So this is the sum. This chart basically, and you can more information about it. I can provide you with more information that sector by sector shows that on average, Israel is doing very poorly. And while service is an important sector, and an important sector in whole economy, including Israel economy, and competition is also very important in this sector. That's a domain where attention is needed. Now, concerning the second question, you said difference between import and exports.
Yeah, what's the ratio?
Okay. This one, this slide, probably. Yeah. Okay. I would say both are important. This is also the same maybe for what we've seen for the previous slide where we see the ranking of the gap or the size of the gap by sector. What we found with the analysis of the global value chain is not so much exports which matters, but imports. Nowadays, for big firms which are basically present in various parts of the world, they import to re-export the same type of products. They bring in, some stuff. It is processed in the country because you have a special expertise, say in Israel in software. But then it's re-export to China because they put that together with low qualified workers. We can do it much cheaper than Israel. The question is, if you have barriers, for importing things, it means that companies say, no, too difficult. I will go elsewhere. So imports are important for competition. So this is like barriers within the country, in a sense. But because we are living in the world economy, global economy, so you have to take that into account in the way you think. And export, of course, because it is a signal that the company, is open to the global market as well. So this is why we've decided to take a kind of average of import and exports. I would say for Israel, the size of both export and import is similar. About 32%. So on average, when you see the other slide, you see that, oops. Well, Israel didn't change very much, but something I could have dig into, but it was afterwards. Maybe it would be good to redo similar charts saying, let's look at sector by sector, I mean the trade openness, and the difference between import and exports to see if this is really the import side which matters in some sectors. And my guess is probably yes. Well, unfortunately, I don't have the response here.